Denver, Colorado, November 5, 2023. Matthew Lewis, a respected 45-year-old financial advisor, was found unresponsive at an upscale gym late one evening. What initially seemed like a tragic workout mishap left those who knew him in shock. Friends and family struggled to make sense of the sudden loss, but as investigators looked closer, unsettling details began to emerge. Behind Matthew's polished image was a life far more complicated than it appeared, and soon, questions arose that no one was prepared to answer. But beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life, cracks had begun to form. Despite his professional success and the picture-perfect home he shared with his wife, Julia, and their two teenage children, something was missing. The long hours at the office, the relentless pursuit of financial success, none of it brought the fulfillment it once did. As time passed, Matthew found himself searching for something more, something to break the monotony of his carefully constructed life. Julia had become more focused on their children, juggling school events, extracurricular activities, and household responsibilities with the precision of a seasoned organizer. Meanwhile, Matthew buried himself in work, spending long hours at the office or meeting clients over dinners that stretched late into the night. Though their marriage was free of dramatic conflicts, it lacked the warmth and spontaneity they once shared. Conversations revolved around schedules, bills, and logistics, leaving little room for connection. In an attempt to shake off the creeping sense of monotony, Matthew joined an upscale gym downtown. He told himself it was to stay fit and relieve stress, but deep down, he enjoyed the sense of control it gave him. The idea that, with enough effort, he could still reshape his life. It was there that he met Amanda Jackson. Amanda was different from the other trainers at the gym. At 24, she was energetic, driven, and effortlessly charismatic. Her confidence radiated through every interaction, making her one of the most sought-after trainers in the facility. While most clients saw her as just another fitness professional, Amanda saw herself as something more. She had ambitions beyond the gym, dreaming of a better life, one filled with luxury and security, things she had never quite achieved on her own. When Amanda first met Matthew, he was just another successful man in need of a lifestyle change. But as their sessions progressed, she noticed things that intrigued her. His expensive watch, the way he carried himself, and the subtle hints of dissatisfaction in his life. To Amanda, Matthew wasn't just a client. He was an opportunity. At first, their interactions were strictly professional. Amanda pushed Matthew to work harder, correcting his form and encouraging him through his workouts. But over time, the sessions took on a different tone. Small talk about fitness goals evolved into deeper conversations about life, work, and family. Amanda listened intently as Matthew spoke about the pressures of his job and how he wished he had more time to focus on himself. She made him feel heard in a way Julia hadn't in years. Amanda had a way of making Matthew feel important. She laughed at his jokes, complimented his dedication, and gave him her undivided attention. In return, Matthew found himself looking forward to his sessions more than he expected. He started staying a little longer after his workouts, lingering in conversation as Amanda stretched beside him, her presence both easy and intoxicating. As the weeks went on, Amanda began pushing the boundaries subtly. She would brush her hand against his arm while adjusting his posture or lean in a little closer than necessary during their post-session chats. She started sharing small details about her own life, how she had struggled to build a career, how she felt undervalued by others, and how she admired his success. Matthew, flattered by the attention, felt a growing connection to her. Julia, preoccupied with the kids and household responsibilities, didn't notice the subtle changes in Matthew's behavior at first. He started coming home later, blaming it on extended meetings and networking events. He paid more attention to his appearance, investing in new gym clothes and even upgrading his cologne. Small things that seemed harmless but hinted at something deeper. Amanda, meanwhile, saw the signs of Matthew's growing interest and seized the opportunity to take things further. One afternoon, as they wrapped up a session, Amanda casually suggested something that took Matthew by surprise. "You know," she said with a smile, wiping sweat from her brow, "we should do a private session outside of gym hours. That way, you can really focus without all the distractions here." Matthew hesitated for a moment, But the idea lingered in his mind long after he left the gym. It wasn't just about fitness anymore. Something about Amanda made him feel younger, more alive. And as much as he told himself it was just training, a small part of him knew it was something more. In the following days, Matthew found himself checking his phone more often, anticipating Amanda's texts about scheduling their sessions. He justified it by telling himself it was all part of his commitment to self-improvement, but deep down, he knew he was treading dangerous territory. Meanwhile, Julia sensed that something felt off but couldn't quite put her finger on it. Matthew seemed more distant, and his sudden enthusiasm for fitness felt out of character. She wondered if it was just a midlife crisis or if there was something, or someone, else behind it. Amanda, on the other hand, knew exactly what she was doing. She was planting the seeds for something far greater than personal training. To her, Matthew represented stability, wealth, and an escape from the financial struggles she had always faced. She wasn't just interested in him. She was determined to make him a part of her future. As Matthew continued to push himself harder at the gym, sweating through early morning sessions and late-night runs, he couldn't escape the growing realization that Amanda was becoming more than just his trainer. Their interactions felt different, more intimate, and despite his better judgment, he found himself wanting more. What started as a simple fitness routine was quickly turning into something much more complicated, something that could change everything he thought he knew about his life. Matthew's late-night training sessions at the gym became more frequent, and what started as innocent conversations soon turned into something much more complicated. The lingering looks, the subtle touches, and the way Amanda made him feel like the center of her world were impossible to ignore. At first, Matthew told himself it was harmless, just a distraction from the stress of work and home life. But deep down, he knew he was crossing a line he couldn't step back from. Amanda, on the other hand, had no doubts. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she wasn't afraid to push Matthew toward it. With every session, she found new ways to draw him in, making their time together feel special and exclusive. She made him laugh, made him forget about his responsibilities, and most of all, made him feel desired. It wasn't long before the after-hours workouts turned into something far more intimate. Their meetings stretched longer and longer, with Matthew staying well past the time he usually would. The gym, once a place of self-improvement, had become their secret hideaway. Amanda was quick to assure him that no one would suspect anything, that they were just two people working on fitness goals. But Matthew knew better. He knew what they were doing wasn't just about staying in shape. It was about escaping from reality. Meanwhile, Julia began to notice the changes. Matthew's late returns, the way he seemed more distracted at home, and the lack of interest in their usual routines all pointed to something being off. She asked him about it one evening as he came through the door, gym bag in hand, sweat still clinging to his shirt. "You've been spending a lot of time at the gym lately," she said casually, watching him closely. Matthew shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Just trying to stay healthy. Work's been stressful, and this helps me clear my head." Julia nodded, but wasn't convinced. The gym had always been part of Matthew's routine, but never to this extent. She noticed how he'd become more particular about his appearance, new clothes, a different cologne, and even a change in his eating habits. Something wasn't adding up. Amanda, however, wasn't concerned about Julia. She had Matthew right where she wanted him. Over coffee at a quiet cafe after one of their sessions, she leaned in close, her voice low and intimate. "You should take some time off work," she suggested. "We could do something outside the gym for once. No pressure, just fun." Matthew hesitated. Spending time with Amanda outside the gym felt dangerous, too real, but the temptation was undeniable. He found himself saying yes before he could think it through. They started meeting at secluded spots around town, quiet restaurants, parks where they wouldn't run into familiar faces, and once, even at Amanda's apartment under the guise of talking things through. Each time they met, Amanda grew more attached. What had started as a casual fling was turning into something deeper for her, while for Matthew, it was still just an escape. He was careful to keep things separate, not letting Amanda get too close to the rest of his life. But Amanda didn't see it that way. She wanted more time, more attention, and eventually, more commitment. Julia's suspicions deepened when she found an unfamiliar scent clinging to Matthew's shirt one evening as she did the laundry. It was subtle, but it wasn't hers, and she knew it. Her mind raced with possibilities, but she pushed the thought aside, telling herself she was being paranoid. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something wasn't right. As Matthew spent more nights working late or hitting the gym, Julia found herself looking through his things more often. She checked his gym bag, his car, even his phone when he wasn't around. He had become more secretive, keeping his phone close and silencing notifications whenever she was near. Amanda, emboldened by their growing connection, started pushing harder. She wanted him to leave Julia, to make their relationship something real. She dropped hints about a future together, about how good they were for each other. But every time the subject came up, Matthew dodged it. "I'm not ready for that," he'd say, brushing her off with a forced smile. "Let's just take things as they come." But Amanda wasn't satisfied with that answer. She wanted him, all of him, and she wasn't willing to be the secret forever. Julia, meanwhile, started digging deeper. One evening, while Matthew was in the shower, she went through his gym bag and found a receipt for a restaurant she had never been to. Her stomach twisted as she realized it was from the same night he had told her he was working late. Determined to get to the bottom of things, she decided to visit the gym unannounced. When she arrived, she watched from a distance, waiting to see if Matthew was actually there. Sure enough, she spotted him. But the way Amanda hovered around him, touching his arm and laughing too easily, made her heart sink. Matthew had no idea Julia was watching, but she saw enough to confirm her growing fears. She left without confronting him, but the evidence was clear. Something was happening between her husband and his trainer. Back at home, Julia tried to act normal, but the tension was palpable. Matthew, caught up in the excitement of his new relationship, was too distracted to notice the shift in her behavior. He chalked it up to her usual stress with the kids, unaware that she was already piecing together the truth. Amanda, oblivious to Julia's growing awareness, continued pushing Matthew for more of his time, pressing him to make decisions he wasn't ready to face. The cracks in their affair were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. Amanda's feelings for Matthew had grown beyond anything she had anticipated. What started as an exciting affair was now something she couldn't imagine living without. She began picturing a life together, just the two of them, free from secrets and complications. In her mind, Julia was the only thing standing in the way of their happiness, and Matthew's reluctance to leave his wife was becoming increasingly frustrating. She started keeping a closer eye on him, tracking his social media activity, noting when he was online and who he interacted with. Every post, every photo, every like became another piece of the puzzle in Amanda's growing obsession. She found herself constantly refreshing his page, looking for signs that he was unhappy at home or that Julia was somehow failing him. When she didn't find what she wanted, she created narratives in her head, convincing herself that Matthew just needed a push in the right direction. Her obsession spilled over into real life. She started showing up unexpectedly at his office, casually waiting outside during his lunch breaks or finding excuses to pop into nearby stores in hopes of running into him. At first, Matthew laughed it off, telling himself it was just coincidence, but soon he began to feel suffocated. Matthew started to pull back, canceling gym sessions with vague excuses about work obligations or family matters. He told himself that if he created some distance, Amanda would get the message and things would cool off naturally. But Amanda wasn't one to take hints. She felt him slipping away and refused to let that happen. Meanwhile, Julia's suspicions continued to grow. She noticed Matthew's hesitation whenever she asked about his gym sessions and the way he avoided eye contact when she brought up his changing schedule. It didn't sit right with her. So one afternoon, she decided to drop by the gym unannounced. As she walked through the front doors, her eyes scanned the room, and there was Amanda, standing by the weight racks. Their eyes met, and Julia introduced herself politely, pretending to be nothing more than a curious wife checking in on her husband's progress. Amanda's smile was too rehearsed, too knowing. She answered Julia's questions with just enough detail to seem professional, but something in the way she spoke felt off. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that Amanda knew more about their life than she should. Julia left the gym feeling unsettled. There was something about the way Amanda spoke about Matthew, too familiar, too personal. It gnawed at her, making her wonder just how much time they had been spending together. She didn't have concrete proof yet, but her instincts told her something wasn't right. Amanda, on the other hand, saw Julia's visit as a challenge, not a threat. She convinced herself that Julia was losing her grip on Matthew, and that it was only a matter of time before he realized where his true happiness lay. Fueled by that belief, she became more assertive in their interactions, sending him texts throughout the day, reminding him of their connection and how much better things could be if he would just let go of his old life. Matthew felt the pressure mounting. The affair had been thrilling at first, an escape from the pressures of work and family, but now it was turning into something he couldn't control. He was torn between guilt and desire, trying to balance both lives without losing everything. One evening, as they sat in his car after another canceled session, Amanda looked at him with a serious expression. "I love you, Matthew," she said softly. The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Matthew froze, caught off guard by the depth of her confession. He managed a weak smile, muttering something about how complicated things were, but it wasn't enough for Amanda. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the fear, and it only made her want him more. From that moment on, Amanda's obsession deepened. She couldn't understand why Matthew wasn't ready to walk away from Julia, and the idea of him staying in his marriage became unbearable. She told herself it was only a matter of time before he realized he belonged with her, but as the days passed and his distance grew, doubt crept in. Amanda's once careful and calculated approach turned more desperate. She started calling him late at night, showing up outside his house just to catch a glimpse of him. Every unanswered text, every missed call felt like a rejection she couldn't accept. Matthew's patience was wearing thin. He knew he had made a mistake by getting involved with Amanda, but he wasn't sure how to end things without making her angry. She was unpredictable, and the last thing he wanted was for her to lash out and expose their affair. Julia, still piecing things together, started paying closer attention to Matthew's habits, noticing the way he guarded his phone and the way his mood shifted whenever he came home late. She wasn't ready to confront him yet, but the feeling that something was off was becoming impossible to ignore. Amanda, desperate to keep Matthew in her life, was willing to do whatever it took to ensure he didn't walk away. In her mind, Julia wasn't just an obstacle. She was the only thing standing in the way of the future Amanda believed she deserved. Amanda's jealousy reached a boiling point when she overheard Matthew mentioning an upcoming anniversary trip with Julia. She had been clinging to the hope that their affair was more than just a temporary escape, that Matthew would eventually leave his wife and choose her. But hearing him talk about the trip shattered those illusions. It was a reminder that she was still just an afterthought, someone he turned to when it was convenient, while Julia remained the center of his world. Amanda couldn't stand it anymore. She confronted Matthew after one of their late-night training sessions at the gym. He was exhausted, wiping sweat from his forehead when Amanda stepped in front of him, her eyes burning with frustration. "You're really going on a trip with her?" she asked, her voice sharp and demanding. Matthew sighed, already sensing where the conversation was heading. "Amanda, it's just a trip. Julia's been wanting this for a while." Amanda crossed her arms tightly. "And what about me? What about everything we've talked about? Are you just going to pretend none of it happened?" Matthew hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. He knew this was bound to happen sooner or later, and he had been dreading it. "Look," he said, his tone softer now, it was a mistake. I need to fix things with Julia." Amanda's heart pounded. "A mistake?" Her voice cracked slightly. "You told me you were unhappy, that you wanted more." "I know," Matthew muttered, rubbing his temples, "but I can't just throw my whole life away. Julia and we have history." Amanda's jaw tightened. "And what do we have, Matthew? What was this to you?" Matthew looked away, avoiding her piercing gaze. "Amanda, I can't do this anymore." The words hit Amanda like a slap. She stepped back, stunned, before her anger took over. "You think you can just walk away from me?" she hissed. "I won't be ignored, Matthew. I will tell Julia everything." Matthew's expression darkened. "Amanda, don't do that. You don't want to make things worse." But Amanda wasn't listening. Rage and heartbreak clouded her judgment. Meanwhile, Julia had been growing more suspicious with each passing day. She noticed how distracted Matthew had become, how he was constantly checking his phone and spending longer hours at the gym. Something wasn't right, and her instincts told her to dig deeper. One evening, while Matthew was in the shower, Julia went through his wallet and found a receipt from a fancy restaurant downtown. The date on it made her stomach drop. It was from the night he had told her he was working late. Julia felt her hands tremble as she flipped through more receipts tucked into his desk drawer. Jewelry stores, hotel reservations, expensive dinners, none of which she had been a part of. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't accuse Matthew without solid proof, but she was done ignoring the signs. Over the next few days, she began tracking his spending habits and quietly monitoring his gym visits. She noticed the way Amanda hovered around him when she showed up unannounced, her touch lingering just a second too long. The way Matthew stiffened when he saw Julia watching from across the room. Amanda, meanwhile, was spiraling. She had convinced herself that Julia was the only thing standing between her and the life she wanted with Matthew. The thought of him going away with his wife, trying to rekindle their marriage, made her blood boil. She had given him everything. Her time, her energy, her love, and she wasn't about to let Julia take him back so easily. One night, Amanda parked outside the Lewis home, watching from a distance as Julia left for one of her regular evening errands. Amanda's mind raced with thoughts she couldn't control. She knew Julia's routines, knew where she shopped, and when she'd be home. The idea of confronting her face-to-face crept into her thoughts, but something held her back. Inside, Matthew sat in his home office, staring blankly at his computer screen. His thoughts were far from work. He was consumed with regret, wondering how things had spiraled so far out of control. The affair had been exciting at first, but now it felt suffocating. Amanda's constant demands and threats were becoming too much to handle, and the guilt of betraying Julia was eating away at him. Julia wasn't done digging. She had been piecing things together, and everything pointed back to Amanda. Determined to get answers, she planned to confront Matthew with everything she had found. She rehearsed the conversation in her head, imagining the excuses he might make, the lies he would tell. But she was ready. Amanda, on the other hand, wasn't willing to wait for things to fall apart on their own. She needed to take control before it was too late. If Julia confronted Matthew, it would ruin everything. Amanda couldn't let that happen. Her thoughts turned darker, more desperate. She had to find a way to ensure that Julia was out of the picture for good. Her phone buzzed with a message from Matthew. "I need some space, Amanda. Please stop texting me." Amanda's grip on the phone tightened. Space? After everything they had been through, he was just going to push her aside? No, she wouldn't let him slip away. The next morning, Julia waited until Matthew left for work before heading to the gym. She wasn't going to accuse anyone just yet. She wanted to see things for herself. Walking into the gym, she scanned the room and spotted Amanda. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Amanda's confident expression faltered. Julia introduced herself with a polite smile, pretending to be nothing more than a curious wife checking in on her husband's progress. Amanda answered her questions carefully, but Julia sensed something was off. The way Amanda spoke about Matthew felt too familiar, too intimate. There was an unspoken tension in the air, and Julia left the gym with a sinking feeling in her gut. Amanda, on the other hand, saw Julia's visit as a warning sign. She was getting too close, asking too many questions. Amanda needed to act fast before everything fell apart. As Julia drove home, she replayed the conversation in her head, realizing that Amanda knew too much about Matthew, about their life, about things she shouldn't. The confirmation was there, even if Julia didn't have solid proof yet. She was going to confront Matthew that evening, once and for all. But Amanda couldn't let that happen. She had worked too hard to get this far, and if Julia thought she could just come in and take Matthew back, she was sorely mistaken. Desperation clouded Amanda's thoughts, and she knew she had to take drastic action before Julia ruined everything. Amanda couldn't accept it. Matthew pulling away, Julia tightening her grip, and the life she envisioned slipping further out of reach. Every time she saw Matthew's hesitation, every moment he spent with Julia instead of her, it fueled the fire of her obsession. If Julia weren't in the picture, everything would fall into place. Matthew would see what they had was real, and he would finally choose her. Late one afternoon, Amanda followed Julia as she left the house for her usual errands. She kept a safe distance, watching as Julia pulled into a shopping center. Amanda parked nearby, heart pounding but face calm, blending in like any other shopper. She watched Julia go in and waited for her moment. When she was sure no one was watching, Amanda approached the car, her hands steady despite the nerves gnawing at her. She had done her research. A small cut to the brake line. Nothing too obvious, just enough to cause failure at the right moment. It had to look like an accident. As she crouched beside the car, she worked quickly, her eyes darting around the parking lot. The whole process took less than 5 minutes. Standing up, she took a deep breath and walked away, her heart racing but her expression cool and composed. Julia wouldn't suspect a thing. Later that evening, Julia left the grocery store, loading her bags into the trunk before getting behind the wheel. She glanced at her phone, scrolling through messages from Matthew, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She started the car and pulled onto the road, heading home as the streetlights flickered on. A few blocks from their house, Julia felt something strange. The brake pedal felt soft, unresponsive. She pressed harder, but the car didn't slow down. Panic surged through her as she approached an intersection. She gripped the wheel tightly, her breathing rapid, trying to steer to safety, but the car veered off the road and slammed into a tree. The impact was violent, and everything went dark. When Matthew got the call, his world crumbled. The words didn't seem real. Julia, an accident, critical condition. He rushed to the hospital, barely processing the questions from the officers who had responded to the scene. Sitting in the waiting room, hands trembling, he couldn't believe how quickly everything had changed. Amanda showed up not long after, her face filled with concern. She had heard about the accident through social media and wanted to be there for him. Matthew barely registered her presence at first, too consumed by his own grief and shock. When the doctor finally came out with a solemn expression, Matthew's worst fears were confirmed. Julia didn't make it. The words hit him like a brick, and he sank into the chair, numb. Amanda was by his side in an instant, rubbing his back, whispering reassurances. "I'm here for you," she said softly. Matthew barely noticed how quickly Amanda stepped into Julia's place, helping with funeral arrangements, fielding calls from friends and family, and making sure he wasn't alone. At first, he was too grief-stricken to question it. Amanda was a familiar presence, someone who understood him, or at least that's what he told himself. In the days that followed, Amanda continued to insert herself into Matthew's life under the guise of support. She cooked meals, kept him company, and reassured him that he wasn't alone. She told him Julia wouldn't want him to suffer, that life had to go on. Slowly but surely, she started to rebuild the illusion of their relationship, pushing him further away from his grief and back into her arms. But the police weren't convinced that Julia's death was just an accident. The damage to the brake system raised questions. The mechanics who examined the wreckage found inconsistencies, noting that the failure didn't appear to be due to wear and tear. There were signs of tampering. Investigators started asking questions. When was the last time the car was serviced? Had Julia noticed anything unusual before? Matthew answered as best he could, but he was too lost in grief to think clearly. Amanda, however, was carefully watching every move they made. She knew the investigation would eventually circle back to her, and she had to stay ahead of it. She played the role of the concerned friend perfectly, never showing a hint of worry. Despite the growing suspicion, Matthew clung to Amanda as his support system. The guilt of his affair gnawed at him, but Amanda made it easy to believe that Julia's death was just a tragic accident, a cruel twist of fate. As the investigation continued, Matthew started noticing small things. Amanda's sudden appearances when he least expected, her eagerness to stay involved in every detail of his life. In moments of clarity, he wondered if things were moving too fast, but Amanda always had a way of reassuring him, of making him feel like he needed her. The police, meanwhile, were quietly piecing things together, retracing Julia's last steps and looking into anyone who might have had a motive. They weren't ready to make any accusations yet, but they were getting closer. Matthew struggled to cope with the aftermath of Julia's sudden death. His once structured life had turned into a blur of condolences, sleepless nights, and a gnawing sense of guilt he couldn't shake. The house, once filled with the comforting routine of their marriage, now felt hollow and unfamiliar. Each room carried memories of Julia, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to their bedroom, the perfectly arranged living room she had decorated with such care, and the stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter that she would have sorted through without a second thought. Through it all, Amanda remained by his side. She filled the silence with her presence, cooking meals, offering reassuring words, and making sure he was never alone for too long. At first, Matthew welcomed the distraction. Amanda made things easier, helping with funeral arrangements, sorting through paperwork, and even answering phone calls when he couldn't bear to talk to anyone. But as the days turned into weeks, her presence started to feel too much. Amanda had a way of weaving herself into every aspect of his life, and Matthew found it increasingly difficult to separate his grief from the comfort she provided. "You don't have to go through this alone," she would say softly, her hand resting lightly on his arm. And for a while, he believed her. But there were things that didn't sit right. Small things at first. Amanda seemed to know too much. Details about Julia's routines, places she frequented, even little habits Matthew hadn't thought anyone else would notice. She mentioned how Julia had been stressed leading up to the accident, how maybe she hadn't been as careful as usual. Matthew found himself questioning how Amanda could know these things. He chalked it up to harmless observation, but the thought lingered. Meanwhile, the investigation into Julia's crash continued. The initial findings suggested brake failure, but the forensic team wasn't convinced. An expert hired to inspect the wreckage noted that the brake lines showed signs of unusual wear, consistent with deliberate tampering rather than a simple malfunction. This raised concerns among the investigators, and they began looking more closely at Julia's final hours. A witness, a cashier at the local grocery store, told officers that she had seen a woman matching Amanda's description in the parking lot shortly before Julia left. "She was just standing there," the cashier recalled, "like she was waiting for something." Another neighbor mentioned seeing Amanda's car parked down the street from the Lewis house more frequently than usual in the days leading up to the accident. Matthew remained unaware of the growing suspicions, but an unsettling feeling began to creep into his thoughts. One evening, while sorting through Julia's belongings, he came across her planner buried under a pile of unopened mail. Flipping through the pages, he found her neat handwriting outlining the errands she had planned on the day of the crash: an oil change, a pharmacy stop, and groceries. Julia had always been diligent about car maintenance, and the idea that she would neglect something as crucial as brake repairs didn't sit right with him. He stared at the page for a long time, the weight of it settling in his chest. Could it have been something more than an accident? Amanda's presence grew even more persistent. She suggested staying over more frequently, insisting that Matthew needed someone around to help him move forward. He hesitated but didn't outright refuse. The house felt empty, and in his fragile state, her companionship was easier than being alone with his thoughts. But as more time passed, Matthew's unease deepened. Amanda's attachment to him had gone beyond casual support. She seemed to be slipping into Julia's role effortlessly. She arranged his appointments, stocked the fridge with his favorite foods, and even left little reminders for him around the house, just like Julia used to. One evening, Matthew sat at his desk, flipping through old papers and trying to make sense of his tangled thoughts. His phone buzzed with a message from Amanda. "Thinking about you. You shouldn't be alone tonight." He stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down, feeling the weight of Amanda's influence pressing down on him. The situation wasn't normal, but he was too drained to push back. Investigators were quietly piecing together the puzzle. They started looking into Amanda's background, discovering that she had a pattern of forming close relationships with clients at the gym, particularly married men. Small transactions on her bank statements pointed to purchases related to car maintenance supplies, items that could easily be linked to the brake failure. When questioned casually, Amanda remained composed, brushing off the investigators' inquiries with ease. She insisted that she and Matthew were just friends, and that she was only trying to help him through a difficult time. But the detectives weren't convinced. Matthew's doubt reached a breaking point one afternoon when he found an unfamiliar key in the kitchen drawer. It was tucked beneath some of Julia's old mail, something that didn't belong. When he examined it closer, his stomach turned. Julia had always been careful with her keys, and this one had Amanda's gym's logo on it. How had it ended up in their house? He confronted Amanda that evening, holding up the key and asking, "How did this get here?" Amanda's expression flickered with something Matthew couldn't quite place before she quickly recovered. "Oh, that must have been from when I was helping you go through things," she said smoothly. "I probably left it behind." Matthew nodded, but a gnawing feeling in his gut told him there was more to it. As Amanda talked, he noticed how easily she deflected, how she always had an answer for everything. The walls were closing in. The doubts, the strange occurrences, and the inconsistencies in Amanda's stories were piling up, and Matthew could no longer ignore them. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the question gnawed at him relentlessly. Had Amanda been involved in Julia's accident? The thought was too much to bear, yet it lingered. And for the first time since the tragedy, Matthew realized he might not be mourning an accident. He might be living alongside its orchestrator. Amanda could feel it. Matthew was slipping away from her. In the weeks following Julia's death, she had successfully positioned herself at the center of his life. But now, cracks were beginning to form. He was distant, distracted, and spending more time alone, retreating into himself rather than leaning on her. Conversations were shorter, his touch absent, and the connection she had fought so hard to build was unraveling before her eyes. Matthew's guilt over Julia's accident was becoming unbearable. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. He started withdrawing from Amanda, spending long hours in his home office, sorting through old paperwork and memories. His mind kept circling back to Julia's meticulous nature. She never would have neglected something as crucial as brake maintenance. The thought gnawed at him, and the investigation wasn't helping. Detectives had quietly reached out again, asking more questions, hinting at inconsistencies. One evening, as Amanda sat beside him on the couch, he finally voiced what had been weighing on his mind. "I need some time, Amanda," he said, staring blankly at the floor. I can't keep pretending things are normal when they're not." Amanda's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" she asked, forcing a soft, understanding tone. Matthew hesitated, rubbing his hands together. "The investigation, they're looking into things again. I just need space to figure stuff out." Amanda's heart pounded in her chest. "You think I had something to do with it?" Her voice cracked, perfectly playing the role of the wounded partner. "Matthew, I've been here for you through everything." "I know," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I need to clear my head." Panic set in. Amanda couldn't let him pull away. She had worked too hard, given up too much. If Matthew started doubting her, everything she had done would be for nothing. She needed to act fast. The next day, Amanda texted Matthew, asking if he could meet her at the gym after hours. "I need your help with something," she wrote. "Some of the equipment is acting up, and I don't trust the staff to fix it." Matthew was hesitant but agreed. He figured it was a good excuse to get out of the house and clear his mind. He arrived at the gym late that evening, the parking lot mostly empty. Amanda greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, leading him inside and locking the doors behind them. She guided him to the free weights area, talking casually about how she'd been struggling with one of the machines. Matthew, still lost in thought, went through the motions of checking the equipment while Amanda carefully mixed a strong sedative into his post-workout drink. "Here, you look like you need this," she said, handing him the bottle. Matthew took a few sips, wiping the sweat from his brow. He barely noticed Amanda watching him closely, waiting for the drug to take effect. Within minutes, his movements slowed, his eyelids growing heavy. He stumbled slightly, grabbing onto the weight rack for support. I don't feel so great," he muttered, blinking rapidly. Amanda's expression didn't change. "Maybe you're just exhausted," she said softly, leading him toward a nearby bench. "Just sit for a minute." As Matthew slumped onto the bench, struggling to stay conscious, Amanda moved quickly. She adjusted the weight machine nearby, positioning it carefully to make the scene look like a tragic accident. Once everything was in place, she nudged Matthew off the bench, letting his weakened body collapse beneath the heavy barbell. She stepped back, watching the scene unfold exactly as she had planned. To anyone walking in, it would look like Matthew had miscalculated, lost control, and been fatally injured by the equipment. Taking a deep breath, Amanda composed herself and dialed 911, forcing the panic into her voice. "It's Matthew," she cried. He's hurt. He was helping me with the weights, and it fell on him." Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Amanda played the role of the devastated girlfriend perfectly, sobbing uncontrollably as they worked around her. But what she didn't realize was that the gym's security cameras had been running the entire time. Detectives arrived shortly after the paramedics, and Amanda repeated her carefully rehearsed story. Matthew had been helping her adjust the equipment when it malfunctioned, trapping him underneath. She painted a picture of a terrible, freak accident that no one could have predicted. But as investigators reviewed the security footage, they began noticing inconsistencies. Amanda's demeanor, the way she moved around the gym with purpose, and the exact sequence of events didn't align with her version of the story. The footage showed her guiding Matthew toward the bench, handing him the drink, and watching him struggle. And then there was the timing, too precise, too orchestrated. Matthew's family, already suspicious of Amanda's involvement in Julia's death, pushed for further investigation. They didn't believe it was just a coincidence that Matthew had died so soon after Julia, and detectives were beginning to agree. Amanda thought she had covered every detail, but the walls were closing in, and this time, she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. Amanda's carefully constructed story began to unravel as investigators took a closer look at the events leading up to Matthew's death. The security footage from the gym painted a different picture from the one she had given authorities. Her calm, calculated movements, and the precise way everything was set up raised red flags. Investigators also uncovered inconsistencies in her statements, and Matthew's family, already suspicious of her involvement in Julia's accident, pushed for answers. Eventually, the evidence was too much to ignore. Amanda was arrested and charged, her facade of grief crumbling under the weight of the truth. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of her obsession with Matthew, how it had driven her to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately take irreversible actions to keep him in her life. The trial captured public attention, with media outlets portraying Amanda as a woman consumed by desire and desperation. She received a 25-year prison sentence, with the possibility of parole after 15 years for good behavior. In the end, Amanda's actions became a cautionary tale of how unchecked obsession can spiral into tragedy. Her story served as a stark reminder of the dangerous lengths people can go to when they refuse to let go. Matthew's loved ones were left grappling with the aftermath, trying to make sense of the destruction left behind.